Yeah, she's saying the transatlantic slave trade began with the Native Americans. And I do not agree with that, and history doesn't agree with it. No historian agrees with that type of shit.
Now, I already made a video on this before he made this live, playing the clips from the book On Savage Shores, showing when the transatlantic slave trade started with native people, specifically the Taínos. And that was happening in 1492. And that happened for 10 years, up until 1502, when the first documented African slaves were being brought over from Africa over to the Caribbean. Now, I have other sources to prove this claim. So I'm going to show you where he plays parts of the book and then where he starts to disagree.
Important new scholarship has started to reveal the extent of indigenous enslavement, but it still rarely features as part of wider histories of Europe and the Americas. And studies of global slavery revolve almost exclusively around African and African-descended victims. The claim that America was built on stolen black bodies and native land is ubiquitous. And while this neat model is literally true, it effaces the many native people whose lives and labor were also stolen by Europeans, and the shared experiences of indigenous and African peoples in the early colonial world. The historian Nancy Van Dusen conservatively estimates that 650,000 indigenous people were forcibly transported to foreign lands during this period. About 300,000 Africans crossed the Atlantic in the same period, around 2% of the estimated 12 million victims of the infamous Triangle Trade, which took place between 1492 and circa 1838. Less than a decade after Europeans first laid claim to indigenous soil, and despite royal decrees against native slavery and exploitation, a stream of kidnapped indigenous Americans was crossing the Atlantic to serve as enslaved people and servants. Columbus himself seized and forcibly transported between 3,000 and 6,000 Caribbean men, women, and children to Europe, becoming one of the largest single traders of enslaved Native Americans. And the surviving sources paint a picture of shipments of indigenous people arriving in Europe in most years, many of whom were destined for domestic service. Unlike the African trade, most indigenous people transported across the Atlantic into slavery were women and children, chosen for their greater adaptability, vulnerability, and sexual availability.
So yes, the first victims of the transatlantic slave trade started with the Taíno. The first
Europe in most years, many of whom were destined for domestic service. Unlike the African trade,
Unlike the African... Hold on. I gotta echo. Unlike the African trade. These are two different slave trades.
I agree. The African trade had to do with the Portuguese taking Africans from Africa into Europe. The transatlantic slave trade started after that. Now, a couple of them will make the claim saying, well, they were being taken to these islands like Cape Verde and Madeira. Mind you, Cape Verde is about 500 miles off the coast of Africa, and Madeira is a little bit further off the coast of Africa. But this was not the start of the transatlantic slave trade just because they were in the Atlantic Ocean. Hence the word transatlantic, meaning crossing the entire ocean to the New World. And then I was asked if I knew the original name of the transatlantic slave trade. I do. It was the triangular trade. It was not the African trade. Because again, those were two different trades. No one is taking away that Africans were first stolen by the Portuguese and taken into Europe. But they had not been brought over across the Atlantic until 1502. And unfortunately, because Columbus knew what the Portuguese had been doing with the Africans into Europe, he took that same model and applied it to Native Americans when he came over here and found us. He then started taking Native Americans across the Atlantic to Europe. Here's the evidence. The book, The Other Slavery, which don't let the title confuse you. It's basically talking about Native American slavery as a whole that has been almost completely erased and not talked about in the historical narrative or put in any kind of history books. This is what he states in his book.
Cannibals, a people very savage and suitable for the purpose, and well made, and of very good intelligence. Columbus's shipments would continue. A year later, in February 1495, he sent 550 Indians from Hispaniola crammed into 4 caravels bound for the slave market of southern Spain, his largest shipment thus far. Michele da Cuneo, a childhood friend who returned to Europe at this time, wrote an unusually explicit letter about his experiences in the New World. Among other things, he reported that his old friend had given him as a present a beautiful Carib girl, Bellissima Kambala, who was brought to my cabin, and seeing her completely naked, as is their custom, the desire to have her came over me. About the slaves with whom he traveled, Cuneo wrote that about 1,600 captives had been brought to the docks, but only 550 of them, the best males and females, could be loaded. The rest were distributed among the Europeans who stayed behind or were turned loose. The caravels were filled to capacity. The conditions were extreme. During the passage, approximately 200 natives perished because they were not used to the cold weather, Cuneo wrote, and we cast their bodies into the sea. Of the remaining Indians, half were ill and very weak when they finally arrived in Spain. With this voyage, Columbus inaugurated the Middle Passage, complete with the overcrowding and high mortality rates commonly associated with African slavery.
Right there he states, with that voyage, Columbus inaugurated, meaning started, the Middle Passage, which was the crossing of the Atlantic, which is the transatlantic slave trade. Now, before anybody says, well, what about any black historians? Do they say this? Yes, they do. Here's one. The paper I'm about to show you, written by Dr. John Chenault, who was also part of the Pan-African Studies Department of the College of Arts and Sciences for 14 years, wrote in this paper, Dismantling the Master's House, Deconstructing the Roots of Anti-Black Racism and the Construction of the Other in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. By the way, side note, I recommend people read this, whether you're native, black, whomever. It's a very good read. The Spanish Inquisition's banning of Arabic texts also set a precedent for book burning as a means of erasing the past of indigenous cultures in the Americas. In the mid-16th century, Diego de Landa, the first bishop of the Yucatan, destroyed the corpus of Mayan literature in an act of utter ignorance and bigotry. Dr. Landa placidly describes and justifies his actions as follows. He then goes on to say perhaps the most effective means for the erasure of the local cultures and histories of the diverse populations that inhabited the Americas and their supplanting with European culture and history occurred through the routine implementation and operation of European colonial policies and practices. Ward Churchill offers this harrowing overview of the European impact on Native Americans. During the 4th century, spanning the time between 1492, when Christopher Columbus first set foot on the New World of a Caribbean beach, and 1892, when the U.S. Census Bureau concluded that there was fewer than 250,000 indigenous people surviving within the country's claimed boundaries, a hemispheric population estimated to have been as great as 125 million was reduced by something over 90%. The people had died in their millions of being hacked apart with axes and swords, burned alive and trampled under horses, hunted as game and fed to dogs, shot, beaten, stabbed, scalped for bounty, hanged on meat hooks and thrown over the sides of ships at sea, worked to death as slave laborers, intentionally starved and frozen to death during a multitude of forced marches and internments, and in an unknown number of instances deliberately infected with epidemic diseases. Those Native Americans also were the first unfortunate victims of the transatlantic slave trade, conveyed to Europe and sold as laborers by the celebrated quote-unquote discoverer, Christopher Columbus. Indigenous erasure goes beyond a bunch of pretendians trying to be us and steal our identity. It goes beyond a bunch of pretendians trying to revise history to fit their narrative. Indigenous erasure is a deep-rooted problem, and this is part of it. The concealing of our history. Adding us back into the story and telling the truth of what happened is not disrespecting any African American or their ancestors. But trying to keep us out of that history is disrespecting indigenous people and our ancestors. And by the way, even though I'm not Taino, I can guarantee you the vast majority of Tainos would agree with what I've been saying. And those that don't are usually my haters anyway. And I have every right to speak on this history because this history is the start of indigenous genocide. I don't have to be Taino to speak on that. Just like you don't have to be Egyptian to speak on Egypt and their history, right? Now you can either perpetuate indigenous erasure or you can tell the full story. That's on you. Have a day.
This is disturbing. BGP, this is getting downright weird. First, it was you and Obsidian trying to erase African Americans being the pioneers of the civil rights movement. Neither of you debunked that historical fact. Now you're trying to rewrite how the transatlantic slave trade started? This is just weird. It's starting to seem like psychological issues, in my opinion. There's a few issues with your narrative, firstly being that you don't seem to know what the transatlantic actually is. A quick Google search and this is what it brought up. You can even see from this screenshot that it states that the transatlantic slave trade started in West Africa. The Native Americans that were taken later on this timeline were also a part of the transatlantic slave trade. It's not two different slave trades. Now, the basis of your claim seems to be centered on the definition of transatlantic. Let's look at that definition. So we can see that there are many definitions just from a simple Google search, but we're going to use the first one. Crossing the Atlantic. Now let's look up what crossing means. Crossing also has several definitions, but the third definition here meets our contextual needs. So, moving across a body of water would fit this definition. Moving from Africa to Europe is indeed the definition of crossing the Atlantic. Doesn't matter the direction or the distance. Seeing as my source was never debunked, your sources are irrelevant and factually incorrect. Finding one Pan-African that fits your narrative doesn't make your assertion correct, especially seeing as there are multiple sources that debunk his narrative, including the one I used in my previous video.
So yes, the first victims of the transatlantic slave trade started with the Taino. We also know that the reason why many African slaves were brought to the Americas was because many indigenous people were dying off either through disease or genocide, massacres. We were taken across the Atlantic first. And no, this isn't Depression Olympics. This is the truth being revealed and told. Because this is part of the indigenous erasure indigenous people go through when our histories are silenced, oppressed, and suppressed. Stop participating in that indigenous erasure. Or at least read the entire source, not cherry pick information. Have a day.
BGP. Good Lord. You're still going? And you're spreading more misinformation. I'm not even sure why you're discussing history anymore. We've already established this isn't your strong suit. I can't believe you said that. You seem to be saying crazier shit every time I see you. I'm not sure what's going on in that little head of yours, but strap in. We're about to debunk this misinformation you're spreading. Native Americans were victims of the transatlantic slave trade, but they were not the first victims of the transatlantic slave trade like you're claiming. This annoys me because I already covered this in a previous video. I'm just going to assume you didn't see that video. The Portuguese were already in Africa taking people in 1441. The Spanish didn't reach the Americas until 1492. That's a 50-year difference, ma'am. I think you once again have things confused. It is not commonly appreciated that the first target of slavery in West Africa were the Moors. The Portuguese and the Spanish referred to all Muslims regardless of racial differences as Moors. A description of the first raids has come down to us through the writings of the Portuguese writer Ajuara. In 1441, a certain young Portuguese Captain Galcals sailed along the coast of southern Morocco and Mauritania gathering ivory, animal hide, and sea lion oil for sale in Lisbon. Sensing an opportunity to capture more slaves, he authorized an ambitious raid the same year under a seasoned and experienced Captain Tristeo who was familiar with the Atlantic coast of West Africa. At first, the capture of a few slaves did not cause a stir in Lisbon. There were already many Muslim slaves in Portugal and Spain, just as there were Christian slaves in North Africa, captured in the frequent wars between the Christians and Muslims. The slaves on both sides were kept as domestic servants, subject to the norms of the respective cultures. But as the benefits of owning slaves became obvious to the richer merchants of Lisbon, and with the trade sanctified by the Pope, investment in slave ventures increased. In 1443, an expedition was financed and organized explicitly to capture more Muslims. The Maghreb was in an advanced state of political disintegration, and the presence of these predatory ships was hardly noticed in the palaces of the emirs, busy plotting against each other. By 1465, Portugal was transporting more than 1,000 slaves a year from southern Morocco, Mauritania, and Senegambia. The Portuguese continued their relentless advance along the African coast. Again, this was already happening in Africa. You are sadly confused, but you spoke with complete authority. It's low-key funny to see you're now doing the same thing that everyone hates B for all and Chief Natural for doing. So if what they're doing is anti-native, then surely what you're doing is anti-black. I find it ironic how quick people can be to erase black accomplishments, inventions, and history. You're taught to dehumanize black people, and it's truly disheartening.